Have you ever wondered why the quietest moments of your life often feel the heaviest? Why is it precisely when no one calls, when there are no messages, when the house feels too big and the heart too small, that something inside you starts to speak louder? Loneliness never announces itself. It settles in slowly, like an uninvited visitor who somehow knows the exact path to the deepest part of the soul. All of us, at some point, experience this kind of emptiness. It's not just about being physically alone. It's feeling disconnected even when surrounded by people, being present in conversations but absent on the inside, smiling on the outside while something quiet accumulates within, asking to be noticed. In that sense, loneliness is not a lack of company, it's a lack of being truly heard. We live in a world that fears silence. We fill every space with noise, screens, notifications, voices, opinions. Silence makes us uncomfortable because it reveals, when everything goes quiet, what we've been avoiding finally has room to surface. And maybe that's why loneliness hurts so much. Not because it's empty, but because it's too honest. There is a kind of silence that doesn't mean abandonment. There is a silence that is language, a silence that doesn't distance but draws closer, a silence that doesn't hide but reveals. Throughout history, the most profound moments of human transformation have almost always happened far from noise, far from applause, far from crowds. It was in the desert, in the night, in isolation, that essential truths were heard. Jesus Christ often appears this way, not as a noise that intrudes, but as a presence that emerges when everything else falls silent. He speaks when no one else does. He draws near when the world pulls away, not in a spectacular way, not with force, but with intimacy, like someone who respects the pace of the heart and waits for silence to prepare the ground. If you've ever felt forgotten, invisible, emotionally distant from everything and everyone, know that this experience is not foreign to the human condition. It does not diminish you. It does not make you weak. On the contrary, it reveals that there is something in you that refuses to settle for superficiality, something that seeks meaning, truth, real presence. Maybe the hardest question isn't why am I alone, but what is this silence trying to show me? And what if what you interpret as absence is actually an invitation? What if loneliness is not a sign of abandonment, but a gentle call, waiting for you to finally listen? There is a kind of loneliness almost no one notices. It doesn't show up in photos, it's not announced in conversations, and it's rarely confessed out loud. It's the loneliness of those who are always surrounded, yet never truly accompanied, of those who fulfill roles, deliver results, maintain relationships, but feel that no one ever touches what is most real inside. This loneliness doesn't come from physical isolation. It's born from the feeling of not being truly seen. Many people experience this right inside their own homes. They sit at the table with family, talk about their day, exchange words, yet carry entire emotions that never find space to exist. Others live this loneliness at work, surrounded by people, meetings, demands, expectations, while carrying a quiet exhaustion no one ever asks about. Some even feel it in their faith. They attend spiritual settings, hear messages, repeat familiar words, but sense that something essential never quite reaches the heart. This is the loneliness no one sees because it doesn't scream. It whispers, and it's often drowned out by a fear of silence. Modern society has taught us to run from any pause. Silence has become uncomfortable, almost threatening. We need sound, stimulation, constant distraction, not because it fulfills us, but because it keeps us from hearing what's happening inside. When everything goes quiet, the questions we avoid begin to surface. The fatigue we keep postponing appears. Old wounds, unresolved frustrations, desires that were never allowed to exist, all come forward. External noise works like an anesthetic. It doesn't heal. It only delays the encounter with inner truth. That may be why loneliness feels so frightening. It strips away distractions and leaves us alone with who we really are. And that encounter requires courage. It's not easy to look inward without masks, without filters, without ready-made answers. It's easier to believe that feeling lonely is a sign of failure, emotional weakness, or even spiritual deficiency. But that idea needs to be dismantled. Jesus Christ deeply understood this kind of loneliness. He knew crowds, but he also knew distance. He was followed by many, but truly understood by few. Even when surrounded, he withdrew. He sought quiet places, not because he rejected people, but because he knew that too many external voices could silence what truly mattered. There is something profoundly human in that. Jesus didn't just teach about loneliness, he lived it. He knew the weight of being misunderstood. He knew the distance of those closest to him. He knew the silence where answers were expected. That didn't make him weaker, it made him whole. Feeling alone, therefore, is not a sign of spiritual weakness. Often, it's a sign of sensitivity, of awareness, of a heart that refuses automatic answers and shallow relationships. The pain you feel is legitimate. It doesn't need to be denied or rushed into spiritual explanations. It needs to be listened to. There is dignity in your pain. There is meaning in your exhaustion. There is a reason this emptiness keeps calling for your attention. Invisible loneliness is often the space where something important begins to take shape. It's not clear yet, it hasn't fully revealed itself, but there's a sense in the air, as if something is about to be understood. Maybe you don't yet know what it is. Maybe you just feel that something is quietly moving inside you. And that feeling, as uncomfortable as it may be, is not random. It prepares the ground. Something is about to be revealed. There is an idea that quietly wounds many people. The belief that when God is silent, he is absent, as if silence were a sign of indifference, distance, abandonment. But that interpretation is born more from human pain than from spiritual truth. God's silence is not empty, it is space, and every space exists so that something can happen. In spiritual life, not everything that transforms makes noise. Some of the deepest changes happen without announcement, without immediate explanation, without clear words. Silence, in this sense, is not a meaningless pause. It is a season of inner formation, a place where the heart begins to be shaped in ways noise would never allow. When we look at the life of Jesus, something curious emerges. There are moments when he says less, yet transforms more. Scenes without long speeches or immediate answers, only presence, a look, a pause, a silence that confronts, but also heals. Jesus understood that not every truth needs to be spoken. Some need to be felt. Others need time to mature. Silence has this strange ability to reveal what noise hides. When everything quiets down, what is superficial loses its grip. Distractions fall away. Defenses weaken. The heart begins to speak. And that's exactly where many people become afraid. Because silence doesn't just reveal God, it reveals us. There are moments when God seems to withdraw external comforts, ready-made answers, visible confirmations, not as punishment, but as preparation. What sustains faith cannot depend solely on external stimulation. It needs internal roots, and roots grow in the dark, in silence, far from applause. In this context, loneliness becomes a portal, not because it's easy to walk through, but because it leads somewhere deeper, a place where faith stops being just a concept and becomes an experience, where the relationship with God is no longer mediated by external voices, but felt from the inside out. Jesus knew this path. He withdrew to quiet places not to escape the world, but to align his heart. He knew noise confuses, but silence reveals. He knew some questions only find answers when we learn to wait, and that some pains only transform when they are faced, not avoided. God's silence does not mean he is inactive. Often it means exactly the opposite. It means something is being built at a level deeper than the mind can immediately understand. Something that cannot be rushed. Something that requires listening, patience, and surrender. Loneliness hurts because it slows us down. It prevents escape. It forces us to stay, but it is precisely in staying that something begins to change. The heart, once restless, becomes more attentive. The soul, once scattered, begins to align, and without noticing, you start being transformed from the inside out. Maybe that's why so many decisive encounters happen in this seemingly empty space. Because there, without distractions, the voice that truly matters finally has room to be heard, not as an imposition, not as a shout, but as a gentle presence only perceived when everything else falls silent. And what if there is a specific reason Jesus chooses to speak precisely when everything feels empty? What if that reason could completely change how you see loneliness, not as loss, but as preparation? There is something deeply revealing about the way Jesus approaches people in moments when they feel most isolated. He doesn't usually appear when everything is resolved, when answers are clear, or when the heart is full of certainty. His presence becomes more noticeable when the ground disappears, when voices fade, and when only the soul remains face to face with itself. Loneliness creates a kind of space no crowd can offer. It strips away external layers, social roles, other people's expectations. When we are alone, we no longer have to maintain images or meet projections. What remains is us, unfiltered. And it is precisely in this exposed place that true intimacy becomes possible. Jesus doesn't seek masks. He doesn't relate to edited versions of who we are. He draws near when there is nothing left to defend. When exhaustion is real, when faith feels fragile, when questions outnumber answers. Loneliness, in that sense, doesn't distance. It draws closer because it creates a space where the encounter can be genuine. We often interpret isolation as rejection, as if people pulling away or delayed answers were signs of abandonment. But from another perspective, loneliness can be seen as an invitation. A quiet call into a deeper relationship, less based on external expectations and more rooted in inner truth. Jesus remains present even when he is not perceived. His apparent absence is not real absence. It is a discreet, respectful presence that does not intrude, but waits. He does not compete with noise. He waits for silence. And when silence comes, his presence becomes clearer. Loneliness also has the power to remove spiritual distractions. What once seemed like faith may reveal itself as habit. What felt like conviction may turn out to be dependence on external stimuli. In isolation, everything superficial dissolves, and what remains shows what is real. Revisiting past experiences of abandonment through this lens can be painful, but also freeing. Moments once seen only as loss can begin to be understood as preparation. Not because the pain wasn't real, but because it wasn't wasted. Something was being built there, even if you weren't aware of it at the time. Jesus draws near in loneliness because there is room to listen, because the heart is more available, because the relationship stops being about performance and becomes sustained by presence. Loneliness then stops being merely the absence of people and becomes fertile ground for a truer encounter. Maybe what you once called abandonment was actually a quiet invitation, an invitation to draw closer to yourself and, in that process, discover that you were never closer to being reached by a presence that does not depend on circumstances. There is a simple yet profound reason Jesus speaks in solitude and not in noise. Noise competes, It demands immediate attention, creates false urgency, fills the mind with sounds that do not nourish the heart. In the middle of it, even true words become just more sound. Solitude, on the other hand, does not compete. It creates space. When everything around you goes quiet, listening shifts inward. It's not that Jesus doesn't speak in the chaos of life. He does. But he is rarely heard there. Excessive stimulation trains us to react, not to perceive, and perception requires silence. Loneliness works as refinement. It doesn't add anything from the outside. It removes. It strips away distractions, other people's expectations, the constant need for approval. In this emptying process, what is essential begins to emerge, and the voice of Jesus doesn't impose itself. It reveals itself in this clean, simple space, almost imperceptible at first. In noise, we look for quick answers. In solitude, we learn to hold questions, and there are questions that only transform us when they are not answered immediately. Jesus respects that timing. He doesn't rush the inner process. He allows silence to prepare the heart for what could not be understood before. That's why loneliness is not punishment. It is a workshop. It's where the inner life is adjusted, tuned, sensitized. What once felt like absence begins to take on a different meaning, not as something comfortable, but as something necessary. And there is something even more subtle that almost no one notices. A simple, everyday sign that reveals when the voice of Jesus begins to be heard in this silence. In the next moment, this will become clear, and when it does, you'll realize that this voice has always been closer than you imagined. Recognizing the presence and voice of Jesus in solitude doesn't require complex techniques or extraordinary experiences. Most of the time, it happens simply, almost in everyday ways. It doesn't come as an external sound, but as an inner clarity that slowly settles in, a sense of alignment, an understanding born not from effort, but from stillness. There is a subtle yet important difference between thoughts born from fear and perceptions that arise from presence. Fear is usually rushed, repetitive, heavy. It pressures, confuses, creates scenarios of loss and urgency. Spiritual guidance, on the other hand, doesn't shout. It calms. Even when it confronts, it carries a sense of truth that doesn't oppress, but guides. In solitude, this contrast becomes clearer. When you allow yourself to sit in silence without immediate distractions, you begin to notice which thoughts drain you and which strengthen you. The voice of Jesus doesn't push, it leads. It doesn't create anxiety but offers peace, even when it points toward difficult paths. Many people wait for extraordinary signs, and in doing so, miss what truly matters. The presence of Jesus often shows up through small inner shifts, a burden that lightens, a decision that becomes clearer, a forgiveness that starts to feel possible, a rest that arrives without logical explanation. These are signs that listening is happening. Solitude also becomes a place of reconnection with yourself. Away from external expectations, you begin to notice who you really are, what you truly feel, what you genuinely need. In this process, God's presence doesn't replace your humanity, it illuminates it. It doesn't erase your emotions, but organizes them. Simple examples help make this clearer. Sometimes you enter silence carrying confusion and leave with clear direction. Other times, you don't leave with answers, but with enough peace to keep going. There are days when nothing changes externally, yet something inside realigns. These inner movements are spiritual language. Hearing Jesus is not, most of the time, about hearing an audible voice. It's noticing when something inside you grows quiet, when a truth settles without force, when the heart finds rest even without having all the explanations. This is accessible. It's not a privilege for a few. It's a human and spiritual experience available to anyone willing to remain in silence with honesty. Solitude, then, stops being a place of abandonment and becomes a space of listening. Not because everything is resolved there, but because there you begin to realize that you were never as alone as you thought. Now, everything that has been said converges at a single point. The solitude that once seemed like mere absence begins to reveal another meaning. It doesn't come to exclude you, but to call you. It doesn't appear as rejection, but as invitation. A quiet invitation into an encounter deeper than noise allows. Throughout life, we learn to associate company with presence and silence with loss. But slowly, you realize that not every presence is real and not every silence is empty. There are silences that hold you, silences that protect you, silences where the presence of Jesus becomes clearer precisely because it doesn't need to compete with anything. In the darkest moments, when distractions fail and answers don't come, the presence of Jesus doesn't move away. It draws closer, not invasively, but steadily, like someone who stays by your side even when unrecognized. Solitude then stops being a sign that something went wrong and becomes a space where something essential is being built. Everything you've lived through, including seasons of isolation, begins to take on new contours. What once felt like only pain reveals learning. What felt like loss reveals growth. Not because the pain was small, but because it wasn't wasted. Jesus doesn't romanticize suffering, but he doesn't ignore it either. He walks through it with you. A quiet hope is born when this understanding settles in. The certainty that you don't need to run from solitude, that it doesn't define your worth or your future, that even when no one else understands what you feel, there is a presence that understands before you can even explain. The ending doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be true. Maybe as you leave this moment, solitude still exists. Circumstances may not have changed, but something inside you has been touched. Something has shifted. A new way of seeing has formed. And now a question remains, not one seeking immediate answers, but reflection. If Jesus chooses to speak precisely when everything goes quiet, what might he be trying to say to you in the silences you've always avoided hearing? Maybe, from today on, solitude will never be seen the same way again.